This is my book review of Strangers to Ourselves by Timothy D. Wilson. So I really like this book. I think it was one of my favorites for sure. I really like the author. He was able to communicate his ideas very simply and really get across a lot of very complicated things, and he put together a lot of other research. He's a professor at the University of Virginia, so he's really I think a good clear writer, and I really like him just like I like Robert Greene. And so I would honestly put this book in one of my top favorites for sure. So I know that's not something I say about most books, but I think this is a really good book that everybody should read. And it's really just about this thing called the adaptive unconscious. And it's the idea that our unconscious mind drives a lot of our activities and thinkings without us really realizing it. So I'm going to go through my notes like I normally do. And I also just want to point out that I added another of his books to my list that I'll hopefully be doing eventually sometime in this book corner series. I don't know when, but that just shows you how much I really like it. And I think it was very helpful and very insightful, because a lot of times we can go through life, do the motions, feel like we're in control, but we're actually not. And you need to try to understand how complex the human mind is. And I think this is a great way to do that. So let's get into the notes here. Okay, so one of the first things he kind of talks about is the idea that our gut reaction or feeling, right, is heavily influenced and controlled by our unconscious mind, which does a lot more processing of information than we realize. Right, so if you think about it, the unconscious mind processes a lot of information we receive that would normally vastly overwhelm us. So for example, think about the room you're in, you're watching this video, right? You're listening to my voice, but also in the background, there's a lot of other images around, right? You see your room, you see the corners, you see the chair, you feel the floor, all these things, right? And so if you go just from a purely sensory perspective, these should all overtake your attention, right? This should be too much for you. You shouldn't be able to handle this. But you're able to selectively focus on things because your conscious is doing that. But your unconscious is actually filtering through a lot of things. And he shows us with the kind of cocktail party effect, where if somebody says your name, right, then that means in a very loud situation, you still hear it. That means that technically your unconscious mind was listening the whole time, but you're able to just pinpoint that. And I think it's very similar to if you have let's say a phone, right? And you say hey Siri, right? And then it pops up usually, right? So that means that your phone, I mean, this is not a great idea, but your phone is always listening to you pretty much, because that's when it knows to pop up when you say those perfect keywords. And that's how your unconscious mind is. It's taking a lot of information. And the thing is, because we're not consciously aware of it, it just kind of goes, and it doesn't mean it's all being directly processed, but at least it's being sorted to some extent and being first seen by something else. Okay. So if you think about this idea, right, of the unconscious mind processing a lot more information than our conscious does, then there is a clear extension, which would be that oftentimes our unconscious mind may be more accurate, since our conscious mind can't always take in so many factors and consider them all due to our cognitive constraints and limitations, right? So one really good example of this is the fact that you can use your kind of, let's say, cognitive mind, right, to convince yourself to take actions that are against your unconscious, right? So people can say that they love someone, but it is their mind and not their gut feeling or unconscious that truly loves them, right? Vice versa can occur when we say we hate someone, but in reality we love them. I think this was shown when I did the book review of The Stranger. There was this old man with his dog, and he said he hated the dog so much. When the dog finally died, he was at a loss for words, and that's when he realized he actually loved him, right? And of course, this is just a fictional character in a story, but that shows how a lot of times we can be ambivalent because our conscious mind can try to use reason too much, and it doesn't have actually access to all information. So we'll talk a lot more. I have a lot more notes on gut feelings and things like that, and how to purposefully kind of quantify, is your gut feeling accurate or not. I think what people often get wrong about our heart and our feelings is that it's probably not our heart per se, but actually our gut feeling that is leading us to be confident in a certain direction. Our unconscious mind makes judgments way before we have all the information, and thus can color our reality and perception of reality before we even experience reality. That's really interesting. So if you think about it, when you go into an experience, you actually already have some set of prejudice or expectation that is coloring your experience. So I think the most interesting thing I've gained from this is that we should be feeding our unconscious with a lot of information, because even if our conscious brain forgets it, right? If I read this book, even if my brain forgets, let's say, most of it, what really is happening is it's not forgetting, it's just stored somewhere that we can't access with our conscious mind. But if you think about it, right, your unconscious mind is still filtering that. And therefore, what we'll talk about later is it can use books and information and whatever as like food for how it makes its decisions. So sometimes you'll have these really strong gut feelings to do something. And we'll talk about whether or not those are accurate, but in the cases that they are accurate, right, they can protect you from harm. They can like lead you into a better direction. And this is why like a lot of that information that you can't consciously, access, it's known to still be in there, because if you think about like things like maybe psychedelics, right, have been shown to bring back memories from people that they had a long time ago, but which they have never thought of or kind of completely forgot existed, which shows that those memories are still there somewhere. Okay, and then he references a study done showing connection in men between power and like sex or sexual desire. So for some reason, the two are linked in men, and could be an explanation for why there's so much sexual harassment and why a lot of times men may struggle to understand the small things that can make someone uncomfortable, especially if this man has a position of power, since this connection is formed with their unconscious mind and not a conscious connection they're aware of. So there's also a lot of prejudice talk in this book of how people can consciously think that they're not being racist, not being prejudiced, but their unconscious is a reflection of society's underlying norms, which are to an extent still slightly racist or prejudiced, and therefore their unconscious actions can lean a certain direction, even if consciously they deny it. Okay, another part of my notes says each of us has a psychological immune system that is us acting like a spin doctor, causing us to put a positive spin on every piece of information we get to lessen the damage and protect our inner self and ensure we feel good about ourselves and only believe good things. Yeah, I think that was like a really big thing, because this explains why so many people believe things that if you were to ask somebody else could not possibly be true, or they're coloring the truth way too much. But it's because you have to break yourself down to actually get at a more objective truth. If you keep gaslighting yourself with all this stuff, then it's going to not really, be anything meaningful, and you're not going to be able to understand the world more closely to what it is. And here's a quote: "The conflict between the need to be accurate and the desire to feel good about ourselves is one of the major battlegrounds of the self." End quote. We typically assume that we have thoughts and then carry out actions in response to our thoughts, but the book brings up this idea that there could be a third unconscious factor that could be the thing that causes both the thought and the action to simultaneously arise, right? Or at least to have them arise, and you think that there's the order with thought and then action. So for example, if we're hungry, there could have been a non-conscious factor telling us we were hungry, and that created the thought that we were hungry, and that then like led to the action to go get food. So you can see how in the mind things become very, very complicated very quickly, and that it's not necessarily the linear relationship we typically think of, because in the conscious mind, that's the only thing you can observe. And therefore, if you only can absorb your own thoughts, then you would think that those thoughts have to be the beginning point, and those things can only be the origin of things, and then you move into action from there. But there could actually be an origin point even beyond that that you can't necessarily access. Okay, so the unconscious mind doesn't control everything, but it definitely controls more than we think, and our conscious mind controls less than we think. However, it's important to realize neither of the two extremes of thought when approaching the unconscious mind are correct. The idea that like it controls everything, and the idea that it doesn't control anything, those are both incorrect. Okay, the unconscious mind is not like the conscious mind in that the unconscious mind has different modules or parts, and they work somewhat separately. We know this since damage to some of them still allows others to function. However, the conscious mind, we only have one, and we typically don't split it ever for anything. So the unconscious mind can kind of process language, can process faces. There's like different kind of parts of that, and they can work in a sense relatively independent of each other. Okay, so our conscious mind has a set of needs, and our unconscious mind has a set of needs. So you can't neglect either, and you need to try and figure out what your unconscious needs are, and unconscious mind needs are, and these are typically overlooked. So typically we just think about consciously what we want, but in reality these can stem, and these can also deviate from a deeper unconscious need. And so this is why you can see people do things that they don't really, agree with, or this is just shown a lot through behavior. And we'll talk about how behavior can be an insight later on into the unconscious mind here. Okay, so our process of thinking and our thoughts can even become a habit themselves, which can run on autopilot, just like driving a car if you're an experienced driver. So, just our process of thinking can actually end up becoming a loop, which becomes a habit, and we can continue to have different thoughts again and again and again over time in a non disordered way, like not like an illness. Non pathogenic was what I was trying to say. Yeah. Okay, so children tend to lean to more unconscious mind than the conscious because their conscious side is still developing. So this is technically, if you're to categorize it, children could be more unconsciously driven until later on in adult life when they have technically a stronger conscious, and then you have these two sides fighting each other. Okay, people go through life with different constructs, which are mental predispositions towards certain traits like honesty or intelligence, and this becomes a major factor to which they evaluate new individuals and shape this person's perspective and worldview. So you could have a construct of like honesty, and you evaluate everyone on honesty, and therefore that colors your worldview in that you will see different things that other people won't see, you'll emphasize other things that people don't emphasize, and so now you can see that each person kind of has their own distinct worldview based off of these different constructs. It has been shown that our friends and those around us likely know us better than we do because they tend to see our unconscious side more directly, and they also don't have any lies to tell themselves about why we do certain things. As such, they don't have a conscious mind that is constantly trying to rationalize everything, and they don't have the incentive to make you feel good that you have. Of course, this is like, at least if you're asking them by someone else without reporting to you, right? And there's a lot of times when friends can also just be wanting to please you. But if you were technically to have a completely objective stranger who has no benefit tied to you, and you're asked them to observe your behavior and write down factually what they know will be pretty accurate compared to your own behavior, because it's easy for us to gaslight ourselves to think, oh, I'm kind or whatever, but what this outside person is doing is they're observing our behavior, and they're using behavior as a judgment of kind of why we do things, or judgment of our kind of thoughts and who we are. And the behavior is really, I think, the one big solid truth, because your unconscious mind will, to some extent, resist or show signs of resisting through kind of like, yeah, through the kind of the veil of the conscious. I think one of the good examples of this is like, yeah, I've seen this before, is like you ask somebody, let's say, about maybe a sensitive topic or something that they feel very strongly about, or that brings up bad emotions for them, like let's say a test that they didn't do well on. You can kind of, if you study their face very closely, you'll notice that there's like a fleeting second of kind of distrust or despair or unhappiness that goes and starts, and then the conscious mind regains control, and then their face becomes more neutral or happy, or they just try to project a certain thing. And so I think this is exactly kind of what we see, in that only an observer can notice that. And I think that's something I have too, is I think my face tends to project a lot of information as well, and that I maybe could do better at like kind of controlling that. But of course, that's like, I just don't think the benefits there as much, but it just shows that there is the struggle between the unconscious and the conscious, right? Our desires and the kind of conscious kind of thing that we try to suppress them with. So yeah, I really like this book. I want to bring up an interesting point. So it argues that we are terrible at predicting our own behavior, but we are all really good at predicting the behavior of those around us. And one of my thoughts I just had was like writing this was, I was wondering if the reason we're so terrible is because we have heavy interference from our conscious mind to make our desires more socially acceptable, to go with a crowd and not stand out. So a lot of the examples he used were like the idea that, like for example, if a loved one is really sick and going to pass away, but they're still alive, you sometimes may have this intruding thought of like, oh, I wish they were, dead. And you don't wish they were dead because you don't like them. You wish because of like partly of the fact of like, it would ease their suffering, they would go and everybody would be kind of able to move past this. But that idea that you wish that a family member is dead is socially unacceptable. And therefore, your conscious mind has to rationalize it or has to suppress it, and it doesn't allow it to come to fruition. And therefore, you're confused about why you feel a certain way. And this kind of confuddling aspect of it can make it very difficult to understand your true emotions and what they result from. So my kind of question or theory was like, I wonder if people who tend to be more socially deviant, right, or take their own path without as much regard to societal norms would potentially be more accurate in predicting their own behavior. And I think this requires a level of being very realistic with yourself and imagining yourself in a vacuum where there's no outside factors, no judgment, no moral constraints, no rules, and no one else. If you are able to do this and accurately report that you're able to do this, not just imagining you can, right? If someone could objectively say, oh, this person is pretty like objective and able to evaluate their own behaviors pretty rationally, which is a very difficult thing to do because, like we mentioned, there's a huge confuddling fog and filter in our mind that tries to warp things to make us feel good about ourselves. However, if you are able to do this, right, then ideally there should be a smaller gap between what you predict your behavior to be and what others around you predict your behavior to be, right? And this is another question I think like about a lot too, is I wonder if this is why people suck so much at investing, because of this heavily clouded way of thinking, and that we can't often be objective about anything because we're too attached personally to certain outcomes to properly consider both possibilities and weigh them properly. Right. So you can see, like, if somebody really believes something very strongly, a lot of times they won't consider the other aspect at all. And so to really evaluate yourself on a rational sense and being objective is you have to be able to fully properly weigh both sides of the system, right? Both sides of the argument, both sides of the problem. This is something like Charlie Munger was talking about. Is like he doesn't take a opinion on anything until he can argue the opposite side better than they can, and then he can take whatever side he wants. But this is something that's very difficult, right? But it also shows how important it is to understand both sides fully and allow yourself that ability to understand it, because otherwise you're just going to be like, just gaslighting yourself endlessly. And like investing and a lot of other kind of things in life are very cold, hard truths in the sense that they don't care what you think. Because if you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, you're right. And there's just this objective, harsh reality to it. And that's why it's often actually, in my opinion, a very good way to test this thinking, to test yourself, to test how objective are you really? Because there's always a way to figure it out, right? It may be very complicated, but if you're objective enough and you don't allow emotions to cloud your thinking, you will be able to figure out something that's useful and make a decision based off of that. And you should be able to like make an investment based off of that, and that should be able to do well. But it's like, just because there's so much clouding in this world, nobody's able to actually do that. Okay, so then if we consider what I said, right, about being kind of socially deviant and like being a smaller gap, right? If what I just said is previously true, this means without observing yourself in a more detached way and recognizing that your actions are shaped largely by stuff you don't necessarily control as much as you think you do. This would suggest that most people are just in their conscious mind. So this is people who don't understand the unconscious mind controls a lot of it. They're just in their conscious mind, a bunch of mirrors that reflect the norms around them that get drilled into them. As they say, recognizing the problem is a problem is the first step to solving it, right? So if you imagine, if you deny the fact that the unconscious mind even exists, then what you're doing is allowing the unconscious mind to still drive your actions, right, without confronting it. And what we talked about and what this book talks about is that the unconscious mind is really just a reflection of a lot of societal norms, right? Because these get drilled into you whether you like it or not from a very young age. And as such, you get guided by this thing that you don't really have control with, and you have to really take the responsibility upon yourself to try to bridge the gap between your unconscious and conscious and the needs and wants of both of those things. Because it's been shown, I'll talk about this I think later, but the larger the gap is, the more unhappy and less emotionally fulfilled you'll be. If you cannot even realize that your actions are so heavily influenced by certain things, then you won't be as successful in changing your actions. I think this is also very important for addiction and change in habits, because you have to be real and honest with yourself about reasons why. Otherwise, you'll continue to spiral in your addiction, right? If you keep saying, I'm not addicted, you're never going to solve it, right? But if you, let's say, are very real with yourself and you understand the exact problem, well, now that you've identified the problem, you can now work towards a solution that can hopefully end the addiction. Another interesting point that was made is there's no objective right version of a person. The conscious mind view that they have of themselves is actually an accurate predictor of their behavior in situations that they can consciously control. So whenever the conscious mind can control things, it will act in a certain way. However, there are certain cases in very like split-second decisions where the conscious mind doesn't even get registered and the unconscious is the only thing that's like triggered. And then that kind of situation, the person will deviate from what their conscious mind would technically do because now it's the unconscious in control. Yeah, however, their unconscious mind is a very accurate predictor of the behavior in situations where they don't exert conscious control or unconsciously act first before they can consciously stop themselves. Yeah. Interesting thing that this book brought up as well is that before learning to talk, studies observe that babies and toddlers are taking in unconscious cues from their parents based on stuff like milk feeding schedules, right? So even very stuff that like we think, oh, like babies don't absorb much knowledge before they can talk because they can't even, learn, or even like at the very, very infant stage, they're just surviving and growing. They can't take in any cues, but it's actually proven that they do. And so after children learn to talk, they seem to take in more conscious cues / development. So if parents set more goals or have more structure, the child later on in life will consciously try to do the same with structure and goals, but their unconscious patterns may not necessarily match. Once we have a theory of ourselves or a story of ourselves and how we function, it's very difficult to tell ourselves that we don't work in that way, given that we are now primed to find examples of when we conform to that narrative rather than all the times we don't conform to it. Right, so this is just kind of like you're looking for evidence that supports your theory, and that's kind of the filters you have over your eyes. So you only see stuff that confirms your narrative. So studies have shown that if our conscious and unconscious beings are more in alignment, this leads to overall better emotional well-being, right? This makes sense in a way because we would imagine that if the two things are more aligned, then there'd be less inner turmoil overall. A lot of times what can happen is our conscious mind can try to suppress our unconscious, and this actually takes a toll on our body. However, most people's conscious and unconscious minds or beings do not correlate well, so this would not be applicable for most people who are not trained or aware of their objective self and who aren't doing any reflection on it. There's just so many like good things in this book. Okay. A lot of the time we don't know the real reason why we do things, but we make up plausible sounding reasons and explanations for our actions that we believe in. People become very heavily affected by the placement of a product that they're buying and tend to choose things more on the right, like on the literal right side of the table. But this is unconscious, and if you ask them why, they'll give you a completely different reason because they seem to be unaware of this connection. And there was these experiments shown where they kind of had this person who had their brain cut partly in half because of like their epilepsy or something. So each side was separated, and they showed the left side a shovel, right? And they primed it or something, and like so they showed it so fast they couldn't realize it, and then they gave the person an option, and the person picked a shovel, and then when they're asked why did you pick the shovel, the other side of their brain made up a completely fake excuse. They're like, oh, shovels are really useful for blah 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 blah, and that's why I like them, even though there's no like other reason that, and it's not a valid reason at all. So it just shows we can fabricate a lot of plausible sounding reasons out of thin air. Okay, a lot of the time we think that having more inside knowledge about ourselves allows us to be more accurate in providing correct reasons for why we take certain actions, but sometimes other people who are complete strangers with no context and who can't read our mind actually can provide more accurate reasoning for why we did some actions because of our inside knowledge, and the inside knowledge we have actually clouds our judgment capacity. Right? Okay, in a study mentioned by the book, people who track their moods for a few weeks and who track factors that might be causing their mood actually had no more accuracy or difference in explaining why they felt certain ways on certain days as a complete stranger who was able to provide very similar explanations based off of, So this can show that a lot of the concepts we believe heavily, like the fact that less sleep will make us less happy, is actually not true, and more of a socially believed construct that we see as stable, even with other people, allowing them to explain our behavior when we typically think that wouldn't be possible. So for example, if these outside people were given just factors like sleep data and stuff like that, and they were asked to predict maybe your mood, they would make the correlation that, oh, on those days you got less sleep, right, you would be like more like sad or something. And when we see the data ourselves, we make the same correlation because this is a societal construct kind of way of thinking. And therefore most people, like I would say like maybe like 99% people all think in the same way, and therefore they're all going to approach it the same way and they're all going to reach the same conclusions. So in those cases, technically there is a high accuracy with what we do. Another interesting aspect of the book said that we should stop thinking that emotions come first, then actions. Oftentimes our emotions and feelings follow us after an event has occurred. So if you think about if you're in a car, it starts just swerving out of control, right? You take action to protect yourselves, and then once the event is over, you feel the fear and you can actually have time to process it, right? So this is a situation where maybe the unconscious mind has to take over immediately because it's a very split-second decision, and the conscious mind doesn't even have time to think, and so you have to do the things to lead yourself to safety. But then once the conscious mind is like safe, then it realizes and it can process things, and then it can create the emotions to describe the kind of event. Okay, and then the author even goes as far to argue that we can have unconscious feelings, which can be defined as feelings that we don't realize we're having in the moment, but that other people assume we are feeling, and that if we think about it later on, we will realize we are feeling those feelings, but only after reflection. So one of the examples is the idea that this person says, I'm in love with this person, right? But to their friends and stuff, it doesn't seem like they're actually in love because maybe they make excuses to not see this person at certain times, or it's just obvious from the outside that they don't seem in love with this person. However, this person consciously has convinced themselves that they're in love with this person, but unconsciously they're actually not, but they don't realize that. And then later on when they break up, then they look back and they realize and they see the evidence of their behaviors, which is signaling like unconscious, like again, these are the behaviors that they're not aware of. They're not like choosing, right? They're just like, they didn't realize that they were trying to avoid them like through these subtle ways, but in those ways that were very obvious to other people, because other people were not clouded by the idea of this conscious kind of rational reasoning and kind of you could think about it like a conscious like thesis or way of thinking, right? And narrative, the idea that I love this person, so if I love this person I cannot act in a certain way. But the friends don't have that, and they're able to see things more objectively, so they see that, oh, actually the behaviors do not line up with this idea that they love them, and therefore they're able to detect your unconscious feelings before you are, because you're clouded by your conscious mind, which I thought was really interesting. Okay, so the biggest takeaway I have from this book is the idea that the biggest barrier to understanding our true unconscious selves is when we internalize societal expectations of how we should act and feel, and then believe that these must be true, and then use this societal belief to suppress and over-rationalize our true feelings to cloak them in societal acceptable feelings. Right? This goes back to kind of what I was saying about, your dead, like, your dying grandma or grandpa, right? And the idea that like you have this feeling that they should like go, but you're not allowed to have that feeling because societally that's not acceptable, and therefore you have to rationalize it, and this causes a bunch of confusion. And so the way to clear up this confusion is you have to allow your unconscious to speak, and you have to throw off kind of some of these societal norms. And I think you can do that and potentially get at more deeper, more objective, relatively truth of why you feel certain ways and what your true feelings actually are. And so if we apply this idea that I like a lot of the concept that nothing is black and white, there's only shades of gray, right? We can see that Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, was right about some things being repressed, and not about everything, right? But right about some things, and that there is an unconscious mind, but at the same time, there are certain structural features of this unconscious mind that he didn't really talk about, right? And I think just overall, right, the one thing I realized from this book, and that the reason why I think for a lot of people, it's very difficult to come to terms with this idea that that their unconscious mind is controlled, is just because it's very scary to acknowledge the power of the unconscious mind, because it means accepting the reality that we're not in control of ourselves as much as we think we are, right? And that's a very like humbling kind of thought, right? And then like it brings up a lot of questions, and it breaks you down to your core and really questions a lot of things about your identity, and people don't like sitting with these questions usually. Okay, this is a cool observation from the book. So the idea is, if people are unsure about their emotions in the moment, they'll unknowingly default into whatever physiological state they're in. So this is why it's possible to make people have stronger feelings of love by doing very exhilarating things like going on roller coasters, because the brain feels very strong, intense emotions, which can then be transferred onto the other person. So the brain feels these very intense emotions, which are not really, originally like put in the kind of category of love, but because you're with this person, your brain has to rationalize why you feel these kind of emotions. Like, for example, the emotion could be like having a fast heartbeat and feeling like very exhilarated and awakened by the epinephrine coursing through your veins. And so they use the rationalization of, oh, I'm with this person, I must love them, right? And so this is where you can kind of get into a weird situation, because your conscious brain is rationalizing too much, and if you don't look back on it, you realize that it's not really you like love them. It's just because that was the situation you were in at that moment, and therefore your brain rationalized that into being, and that's the narrative that you tell yourself. A big issue with the unconscious mind is that it typically can just mirror societal expectations, and it is stronger than the conscious mind in some situations. So this causes a lot of problems. Yeah, we're going to talk about racism, right? So with racism, because even if someone thinks they're acting kindly and fairly towards a certain group at a certain level, you may notice their less obvious behavior, which can signal more of their unconscious desire as actually still being judgmental and prejudiced. A really cool thing about this book was that it mentioned that there is evidence that happiness is actually a personality trait and is inheritable. And then this book went into talk a little bit about happiness, which I thought was pretty interesting too. So they're talking about how like short-term happiness is very dependent on comparison points and how far we go away from our baseline that we adjust, right? So anything that becomes a baseline norm, we'll adjust to, and in the long run, no change to our happiness will occur. It also said like happiness is like blood pressure, right? It will adjust and can go to the extremes in short terms. It can go up and down a lot, but will always revert back to the mean or the average, right? We can do small things every day to make our baseline slightly higher, like being more grateful and noticing nature and small things in life and appreciating that. But other than that, we can't change it much, right? And when we think about, this is a really interesting thing too, when we think about how happy a certain event will make us, we tend to think of that event in a vacuum. And as such, we don't realize that there are actually going to be a lot of other different events which make us happy or sad that occur at the same time or very close to this event, which would make us realize that, oh, actually the happiness from this one event is not going to stand out that much because we're going to have these other events that follow and make us feel different ways as well. And this leads us to honestly over attribute the happiness that we'll feel, let's say winning the lottery. That was one example used here. Winning the lottery actually will not bring you much happiness because there's a lot of targeting. You get very targeted by people around you. It breaks a lot of relationships. People hate you. They want your money. And as such, right, also you have to go on with life after that point. And people actually a lot of times will end up broke again. And so they would actually wish that they didn't have it. And so this kind of shows how much we can think that winning the lottery will make us super happy. But in reality, when it happens, you ask everybody who's won it, they actually, 5 years out, they would wish that they hadn't. Okay, so to some extent, introspection, which is the idea of thinking more about what we want and why, can be helpful, but if it is overdone, it just creates more problems and can actually confuse us more. So some is good, but not too much. Some is good, but too much is definitely not helpful, right? So let's kind of break that down. When we try to explain or provide reasons for why we feel a certain way, because we actually aren't that good for knowing the real reason why, we tend to just rely heavily on cultural norms to explain why, but then we think that these are the real reasons why we feel a certain way, and then change our beliefs and feelings, making the process very complicated and not very fruitful. These new reasons we come up with are often just plain wrong, and acting on them can have disastrous consequences. When we try to reason our feelings, we often start to prioritize heavily faulty data that is anecdote-based and doesn't represent the entirety of the situation, which causes us to potentially come to false conclusions. In an experiment where people had to list out reasons for why they liked a piece of art before they took it home, those who didn't have to explain why they liked it actually enjoyed the art more once at home than those who provided a bunch of reasons for it. Maybe providing reasons for everything isn't great since our reasons are probably not even right to begin with, but once we create the reasons, we have to and are forced to believe them. So the book says, quote, "It is important to distinguish from informed and uninformed gut feelings. We should gather as much information as possible to allow our adaptive unconscious to make a stable, informed evaluation rather than an ill-informed one," end quote. So for example, right, it's not a good idea to marry the first person you're attracted to, but if you get to know this person very well over time and you still have a positive gut feeling, this can be read as a good sign from your unconscious mind. So listing lots of reasons seems to hurt you if you lack a bunch of knowledge because you can be heavily influenced by these reasons since you don't have any other information to go off of. But if you already have a lot of information, the reasons you list seem to affect you less. Okay, so the one way to get around this kind of idea is to imagine yourself in a future situation in great detail when one certain outcome has occurred. So for example, a partner, somebody you love breaking up with you, or you winning a bunch of money, and you have to really be very objective and have a lot of detail in this idea, then that gut feeling that results from this can tend to be relatively more accurate as long as you, in that moment when you're imagining it, you disregard societal expectations, right? So for example, if a partner breaks up with you, but like you don't want to rationalize this situation, right? You don't want to think that, oh, winning a bunch of money will make me happy because everybody tells me winning a bunch of money will make me happy, right? You want to think about the actual situation, winning the money, and then what, right? Thinking about what happens after that point. So for example, if somebody breaks up with you, yeah, you'll probably be sad, but then what happens after that point? And then if you can kind of put your mind in that state, right, you have a better chance of actually being more accurately represented and letting your unconscious seep through and then feeling that. And then that can potentially give you an accurate representation of what you would actually unconsciously feel in that moment. So thinking more about your depression and ruminating on it makes you more depressed. However, journaling and writing your emotions and thoughts down about a traumatic experiences or just very intense emotions can be cathartic and release some of the pressure from, because typically with these very intense emotions, we are constantly suppressing them to avoid thinking about them. And this constant suppression can take a toll on the body. Writing in this case can help people create a narrative about what happened, and this kind of journaling or writing is only helpful once there is some distance or time passing from the event, because otherwise emotions will play far too strong of a role for the exercise to be helpful. So it's like, this is what I was talking about before. We repress a lot of things. If you can face it and just write it down, and you don't have to have correct reason, you just write everything you want and just write it out. And then as long as there's enough distance from that event, you will have cathartic experience because now you no longer have to repress it and you've faced it, and therefore you'll have a net benefit from that. And so a good point I got from this book too is that even if nothing improves, just talking to someone about the issue can be very healing, cathartic, as it releases some of the tension of being the only one with no one to relate to. This can also potentially explain why some people, either in different groups or cults or even like some religions, right, can stick so strongly together because they feel they have a shared experience with someone who truly understands them. I think this is especially important to understand given the fact that our world is digitized and people are extremely isolated, especially men who tend to close off their feelings and find it much more socially acceptable to be isolated. Regardless of gender, though, not having someone to talk to or confide with about issues can have negative effects on our mental health. Okay, we're getting close to the end here, so still got some more notes though. Sometimes our theories of ourselves or how we view ourselves is out of date and needs to be updated since we can change over time, and we should use other people's views of us as a more objective reference point in the situation, because our own views of ourselves may be tied to habit and past assumptions about ourselves. So the book uses this example of this guy who kept saying, I'm shy, I'm shy, I'm shy, I'm shy. And I think when he was very young, he was shy, but then something throughout like high school and college changed and he became much more outgoing. And at this point, everyone around him said, no, you're not shy because you talk to everybody all the time, right? You're very welcoming, warming, all this stuff. And so in this situation, the guy should not trust his conscious rationalization because his conscious rationalization is a remnant of his past. It was something he told himself before he underwent this transformation, and something he clung onto. However, in this situation, he should trust the people around him because they're more objective observers of his actual behavior, and the behavior can then lead to a new narrative, a new rationalization, which is the fact that no, I'm not shy, I'm actually an extrovert, I like being with people, or etc., etc., etc. Okay, if we want to change our unconscious view of ourselves, so I think this is the most important part of the book, because you may have an unconscious view that's like not great. How do we change it? You have to first do so through changing our behavior first, right? You can't just say you're going to change your thinking for it to be effective at an unconscious level. That only works at the conscious level, right? And this is because the unconscious gathers information from our actual actions, not just what we tell ourselves, right? Because we tell ourselves we can't control our unconscious because that's an area that our mind can't even go. So through our behaviors, it starts to influence our kind of unconscious, right? And the changing behavior is also the first step in changing identity as well, because our identity is largely based on our behavior, not what we think or tell ourselves, but how we act. And because of the fact that the unconscious mind is kind of slowly taking in these kind of pieces of information that we're not always paying attention to, the behavior is a great way to do that because you're emulating that activity, and that's something you're not necessarily thinking about of how that's shaping your mind, right? Typically, we think of behavior as coming from the mind, from a thought into behavior, into action. But in reality, right, you can have that go backward in action and behavior, then become a part of the unconscious, which affects your identity and your sense of self, because then you can go backwards and rationalize, because I did this, right? Your unconscious mind can then think, oh, if I do something good, right, then I would become a good person, right? Something like that. So that's like the concept of do good to be good can be very powerful. And that's what this book kind of mentioned, right? It says to become a better person, right? We actually start with our actions and do good actions. And over time, this will transform us slowly but surely. This is because you can rationalize from, oh, I'm somebody who does a lot of good actions, therefore I must be a good person, right? And this can also go in the other way. If you do a lot of bad things, it can be very difficult to change that. So therefore you rationalize, oh, I must be a bad person. And so this was like, I think one of the key aspects, right? If you have an unconscious side that you don't really like or like you want to change, behavior is the key to kind of do that. And I think in this book, you see how fluid things are going from action, like, back to thought and unconsciousness, from thought into action, and that there's an interplay that goes both ways. A lot of times people only go one way with it, but in reality, you can go back and forth. So that was my book review. If you have any questions, put them down below, and I'll see you in the next one.